Good morning. Welcome to our webinar to launch the program for the Month of the Dominican Family for Peace for the year 2021. I am Friar and Father Brendan Curran, a Dominican friar of the province of St. Albert the Great in the United States, a provincial promoter and co-promoter of the region of North America. And I am very proud to be here with all of you today. Today, we launch the Month for Peace for Venezuela. And today, we have a wonderful panel to share with all of you various important points about the reality of the Dominican family in Venezuela and the people of Venezuela. Within a few moments, we're going to present our panelists. But for a moment, I would like to present them one by one. And I'd like first to ask a favor. Before the program begins, I would like you to please lower your volume, please. And also try the program. We're going to have a pause after each presentation so that you may comment. There will be comments offered. The format for giving comments for this program will be by chat. I would like to please ask you so that you can please write a phrase or a question or a comment you might have for our panelists during the program. We're going to take some moments for a plenary session at which you can share your comments live. We're going to use the chat in order to help the panelists so that they can listen, they can see your comments during the program. Again, welcome to our webinar program for the Dominican Month for Peace 2021, Venezuela. I am your host, the North American promoter, Father Brendan Curran. First presentation, we're going to listen to Guillermo Méndez, a Dominican friar from Venezuela and professor from the Seminary of Divina Pastora in Barquisimeto and parish priest of Holy Spirit Parish in Barquisimeto, Venezuela. Then we're going to hear from another friar from Venezuela, Brother Osvaldo Montilla, professor of the Central University of Venezuela and of the Catholic University Andrés Bello. At the end, we'll hear from a leader, Reinaldo Rubén Raskin Montiel, a lawyer and ex-consul of Venezuela in Los Angeles and Chicago in the 1980s, and a founding member of a group for an NGO for democracy in Venezuela. I would like to welcome you all to our program, and we may now begin to participate in this, and I am so grateful for your participation on this day. Now, let's listen to the first panelist, Father Guillermo Méndez, professor of the Seminary of Vida Pastora in Barquisimeto and parish priest from Espíritu Santo Parish in Barquisimeto, Venezuela, who will comment on Democracy Today, a reading from and about Venezuela. And he will talk about what democracy means in Venezuela at this time. Onwards, you have the floor. Good afternoon. Hello to all the participants in this webinar. I'm going to enter into the material I'd like to share with you all. Democracy Today, a reading from and about our Venezuela. First, why should we ask ourselves about this issue? Venezuela has nearly 29 million inhabitants, 94% of whom live in poverty and 67% in extreme poverty. The complex issue of poverty, exclusion, and inequality in the country is closely linked to that of public policies and the situation of the Venezuelan democracy. In 2019, 1,200 people were asked about the national political situation, and respondents reported a desire to vote for change while at the same time, they also reported a great distrust toward the conditions of political and electoral participation that has been sown in the heart of the country, and as a result, feelings of disillusionment, depression, annoyance, sadness, and hopelessness about the Venezuelan social and political scenario. Recently, in 2020 to 2021, we, the friars, nuns, and Dominican laity of the Dominican family in Venezuela, questioned ourselves about the current crisis, and it became evident from the obtained answers that there is a deep national political problem. Today, that is yesterday, November 17th of 2021, the Venezuelan Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a document stating that, quote, the electoral issue has provoked internal apathy in a great majority of the people, arrogance in a minority, and has led to a fracture of many political party options. In any case, the fundamental thing is not to remain in the quarrel and the conflict, but to face them and to work to overcome them for the sake of a greater good, which is a present and a more dignified future for the Venezuelan people, our nation. It is not so much a matter of looking individually at what I gain or what I lose, but to transcend to the community level to know what we gain or what we lose as a society within the political, social reality as a whole. The purpose of an electoral process today, therefore, is not only to choose a group of authorities, but to send an unequivocal sign of determination and commitment to the refoundation of life, liberty, justice, and peace for 30 million people. End quote. Venezuelan archbishops and bishops invite the citizenry, each citizen in particular, to take very seriously and maturely whether or not to participate in the regional and local elections of November 21st, 2021, and after the elections to overcome the generalized internal apathy toward politics, and to become guarantors that the elected governors, mayors, and city councilors assume their democratic political responsibility, and that the above-mentioned become effective bridges for all in the solution of problems in the country. The democratic system, the political and electoral involvement, the apathy toward politics in Venezuela appear to be pressing matters to be addressed in order to solve serious internal problems, seek the common good, and achieve a more just society. Consequently, as Venezuelans, we are entitled to question democracy in our country. We will spend a few words on this subject. Second point, now, what is the definition of democracy? Corina Iturbe addresses Norberto Bobbio's legacy to political science, reflects on democracy following the path traced by the Italian author, and provides a minimal definition of democracy, which to some extent we will follow. This is, quote, democracy is neither an ideology nor a type of social system with a certain content or specific political program. Democracy is understood as a set of game rules that allow the people governed to periodically decide on the people who will have the right to make collective decisions, as well as on the programs that are supposed to guide the content of those decisions. Therefore, the rules of the democratic game prescribe how to decide and not what to decide. End quote. The rules of the democratic game will allow for the peaceful resolution of conflicts, coexistence and competition between institutions, ideologies, points of view, different political forces, and offers. They will allow citizens to participate in political decision-making on the basis of certain democratic values or ideals, namely equality and freedom, guaranteed by the existence of the rule of law. Democracy would thus result in a method or procedure that would lead to coexistence based on justice and peace, nonviolence, and the exercise of citizenship. Such rules stem from raising questions about who and how in the democratic political game and are ordered by the values of equality and political freedom. The rules of the democratic game will tell us who the players are, how they should play, and what moves they can make. Briefly, they would be as follows. First, who are those entitled to participate in the processes of democracy? All adult citizens. Universal suffrage makes everyone equal in terms of political rights and avoids exclusion or discrimination based on sex, culture, or wealth. Second, the principle of voting equality, since it is understood without discussion that each vote shall have the same value as another vote. Third, the majority principle, where it is assumed that decisions are made according to the numerical majority. Fourth, Voting, in addition to being equal, must be unrestricted and entail political and individual freedoms. The democratic system does not assess the political offers on its own. It does not measure which one is better or worse, but it allows to find out which political option would be the most acceptable for all, according to the results of the vote count. Democracy must guarantee that citizens can express their opinions and organize themselves politically as they wish. Therefore, it implies a commitment among the parties, citizens, political parties, and political forces to resolve differences and conflicts by favoring agreement without resorting to violence and respecting at all times the rules set and democratic institutions. Thus, in a democratic system, the adversary is no longer an enemy to be destroyed, but an opponent who, at some point, could take the leading position. The political struggle is valid. However, to be considered legitimate, it must follow the rules of the democratic game, respecting the rule of law, allowing all citizens to participate peacefully in collective decision-making, seeking the resolution of conflicts without violence, in equality and freedom. It is important to clarify that such conflicts will never be definitively resolved. Therefore, the chosen political options can always be re-evaluated, seeking more acceptable proposals every day. Solid democracies give rise to robust plural societies where it is possible for a multitude of organized political forces to coexist in justice and peace, which may come to power or politically influence collective decision-making in a peaceful way by participating in electoral processes. Thus, political parties, as political institutions representing one or another political option or ideology, following the rules of the democratic game and respecting the values of equality and political freedom and the rule of law, must act as mediators between citizens, proposals, and governments. 3. What have we seen? Fernando Mires discusses reports by the International Development Bank, or IDB, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which discuss democratic political development in Latin America. And the first thing that becomes clear is that the political heterogeneity of the region is indisputable. However, the Chilean author highlights what seems to be common to all nations on this side of the world. Quote, according to the IDB report, the political landscape in Latin America is characterized by weak political parties, apathy toward democracy, a weak judicial system, low levels of political interest, and deadlock between the legislative and executive branches. In addition, according to the IISS, with notable exceptions, democracy in most Latin American countries has not functioned. On the contrary, they have been associated with corruption, crime, and violence. Only 35% of Latin Americans, compared with 47% of Europeans, are satisfied with their democracy. End quote. Although in his article, Mires does not speak directly about Venezuela, it seems that this quote describes, to a large extent, what is happening in the country and what we have tried to indicate at the beginning of this text. We briefly discuss the Venezuelan case in more detail below. From 1998 to date, there has been a political process that shows that by promoting a revolutionary proposal, the democratic system in the country has been compromised. The executive, legislative, judicial, and moral branches added by the Constitution of 1999 have gradually been taken over by Chavismo, or the 21st century socialism. Backed by repeated elections, however doubtful, throughout more than 2 decades, the administration, first of Chávez Frías and now of Nicolás Maduro, has defended its legitimacy, and this, combined with the loss of the autonomy of the public powers, evidences the erosion of the democratic system in Venezuela, which leads to the difficulty of political opposition in the country and of the free exercise of citizenship by the Venezuelan people. What has been said in these paragraphs are situations that bring with them the diaspora of many Venezuelans, and with it, the dispersal of thousands of families, repeated violations of human rights, scenarios of political violence, the destruction of state-owned oil company PDVSA and the national oil industry, multiple expropriations of private initiatives, and the ruin of the country's production and economy, the scourge of corruption, hyperinflation and dollarization, the inefficiency of health, education, and security systems, the profound humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, etc. In Venezuela, there have certainly been multiple electoral processes, but the autonomy and independence of the public authorities has been lost, as they have been immersed in ideological offers that only favor the government. However, citizens still have a strong desire to vote for a change, but in the absence of guarantees, equality, political freedom, and different political offers, a great distrust towards the conditions of political and electoral participation has been sown in the heart of the country, and as a result, feelings of disillusionment, depression, annoyance, sadness, and hopelessness about the Venezuelan social and political scenario of today have been fostered. Voting is not exercised in a free and equal manner. The administration of Chavez Frias then and then of Nicolás Maduro now exerts media and street pressure to intimidate its opponents and to gain followers to its ranks. In consequence, the political rights of citizens in general and in particular are not recognized. Many opposition leaders and even ordinary citizens who criticize socialism of the 21st century are threatened and politically banned. Many have had to leave the country due to threats to their safety and that of their families. The action of traditional political parties whose political insignia have been taken away and whose party ranks have been infiltrated has been restricted. There is much more we could say, but we don't have time enough to do it. In short, the rules of the democratic game in Venezuela have been broken. The values of equality and political freedom are not observed, nor are there guarantees for a healthy participation in electoral contests. The political rights of the citizens are violated. Democratic institutions in the country have been destroyed, and public powers have been hijacked. The number of elections held does not guarantee that democracy is functioning well on Venezuelan territory. There is a major national political issue that is resulting in a severe humanitarian crisis. Venezuela is suffering. Can we be indifferent to it? 4. How to react to this. The Dominican family of Venezuela, the friars, nuns, and lay people on the Dominican order, feel called to respond to the current crisis in this suffering Venezuela through education, specifically with an educational project that cultivates faith, virtues, and Christian values that shed light upon our troubled present and promote a different, more just society, where profound changes are possible to help achieve the common good in Venezuelan life. An educational project that follows the Dominican tradition and strengthens democratic values, the exercise of citizenship, and the defense of human rights, both in and out of school, on-site, and/or virtual education, in a simple but effective format that benefits everyone equally, paying close attention to the country's youth, raising awareness of the social, political, and economic crisis in Venezuela that especially affects the Venezuelan family. The aim of this project is to further study the problems experienced in the country and to make them known, both nationally and internationally, so that Venezuelans may develop the necessary critical awareness to overcome this historical crisis. Thank you. Thank you so much, Guillermo, Brother Guillermo, for your analysis and your observations to help us. If you like, there are some comments in the chat. And just a reminder to everyone else, those who are attending our webinar, please put in a comment, a question in the chat, and the presenters, after the presentations, will answer, respond, or share something, the analysis that you would like to ask for. Thank you so very much for your presentation and participation with us. After each presenter, we're going to take a little moment so that we might share a few words. Brother Guillermo, if you would like to comment to some comment in the chat that you have just seen or read here, please go ahead and do so. Let me take a look from the beginning, of course. Well, let me take a look first. Oh, no worries, brother, no worries. A question that some have commented in the chat. If you could please talk a little bit about the the state of the balance of power, of political power, is this balance in danger? As you have mentioned in your presentation, could you please offer a little review to a word that you used, which we have already heard, a very common word in very different places of the world, where the word democracy. Brother Guillermo, could you please comment? What does democracy mean in Venezuela in these recent years? I know you mentioned, we already talked about it, but if you could please elaborate, if you could please comment. Yes, in Venezuela, the concept of democracy has been reduced to the planning of electoral processes of elections. What does this mean? That they try to sell that we're in a democratic system because there are various elections being held almost annually. And so these electoral processes, these elections, will set forth certain questions or political issues. The president, the deputies, the legislative assembly, governors, etc. And so they've reduced the concept of democracy to the creation of these electoral processes, which have no proper appropriate conditions to guarantee the participation of those who are of an opposite or a different political tendency than the government that's in power. And so what is being violated are the possibilities for there to be a truly a playing of the democratic game with rules that can be evaluated by all. If I have an election in which, in some way, I'm the government, I'm controlling the electoral power in such a way that we coordinate the process of the election in a way that I can influence the outcome, so that the opposition can't arrive. Let's say it doesn't have a chance to arrive. Then that's what we're dealing with. It's a reduction of democracy to voting in an electoral process. And we see that these electoral processes are they're not free or transparent, nor do they give an opportunity to everyone. There is a manipulation throughout the prior electoral process in such a way that it opaques, it makes difficult, it makes impossible the participation of the opposition. And neither the citizenry nor the various parties of different tendencies can express themselves or freely or truly influence the outcome. This, beyond the topic, beyond the political issue in question, has had various consequences, and those who have public positions in the country, public charges, those who are charged with resolving social problems, are the ones who are of the dominant political tendency of the government, and those who are from the opposition, if they do win some of these elections, their chances of doing anything, of accomplishing anything, are curtailed and limited. They're cornered. So the government controls these processes, these elections, to benefit themselves. They've taken away from the political, for example, they've stripped the traditional political parties of their insignias, their logos, their colors, in a way to create confusion, because people who go to vote understand that for the such and such a color is associated with the opposition, a certain logo or symbol, but the government has taken these symbols. So there's a whole dynamic that has contributed to democracy and to be limited. So what's the problem here beyond the political problem? And it's that this has created apathy among the citizenry. That is to say, citizens are not motivated to, in any way, to influence in the social dynamic, nor in the political process. And this has generated a fracture. And just as the factor of Chavismo has hijacked the democratic system, hijacked democracy, it's also generated this situation where the people have sort of felt alienated from this process. And so there is a large number of people, just ordinary people on the street who don't really care that much about elections. And so public this has created a situation much more profound publicly than. So this is perhaps what the Bishops' Conference is denouncing, that the accompaniment that has to happen to oversee public positions, public office, is not overseen, and so people try to resolve their problems as far away from the formal structures as possible. And this dynamic has been occasioned by the over-politicization of Venezuela. But in recent years, this has led to this has worsened to a terrible degree. And now, for example, this coming Sunday, we have elections. But to be honest, there is a complete lack of understanding of what was said, who's being elected or what people are voting on. People are just not interested in this. And so it's supposedly these people that we would be voting on are the people who are going to be the mayors, the governors, the people who are the closest to the community, but people don't even know who they are. Why are they there? What's on offer? What are their platforms? They have no idea. And so this reduces the participation. And this dynamic, in some fashion, weakens democracy in such wise that it breaks the rules of the democratic game. And this has led to many, many problems from a political perspective and from the perspective of the citizenry. And this dynamic has led to the need for many to abandon the country, to just leave the country. Because in order to move forward, there's no way to move forward here. This whole political situation has led to a system, a perverse economic system where there's hyperinflation, which has no legitimate economic basis. It's really because hyperinflation due to political dynamics. So the political dynamic of the government plays with the needs of the people, so that the people becomes dependent on the public policy of the government, and so politics emerge that. Where, for example, we have the redistribution of food is going to be it doesn't really resolve any of the people's problems. Rather, it generates dependence, because if you are against the government, they take you out of that same system of redistribution of food. Brother Guillermo, thank you so much for this. At this time, we just want to remind everyone. First, I wanted to affirm that the many who put very profound questions in the chat, please don't lose heart during the Q&A. We're going to try to get to these later on. We have other presenters who will comment later as well. This is not the last webinar. We're going to speak about the pastoral projects. We already mentioned how young people can participate in these pastoral initiatives. The question of this coalition of the United Nations, and also this government coalition. We'll speak a little more about this toward the end of this webinar, because we have other presenters who are going to touch part of the topic specifically of the upcoming Sunday elections. So if it's not too much of a bother, time is flying by. So Guillermo, thank you so much for your participation in this part of our program. And now let's go on to the next presenter, because we also want to hear from Friar Osvaldo the reality and dynamic of religion, of the church in the last 20 years. And we have a presenter who is quite excellent in Brother Osvaldo Montilla, professor of the Central University of Venezuela and the Catholic University Andrés Bello. He's going to comment now on the church and the government. Is there a relationship, or what's the tension between them? So we're going to hear from Brother Osvaldo in a moment. You have the floor, brother. Good afternoon, good day. I don't know what time it is where you are listening to me right now, but I'm very grateful to the Dominican family, to all of you here, to Friar Brendan, and all of you who have invited me to participate here in this conversation. More than a presentation, it's a conversation about the reality lived in our country. As Brother Brendan mentioned, I have, as my part in this afternoon, the relationships between the church and state in Venezuela during the past 20 years. I'm going to divide this in 3 sections. And the first will be the government of Venezuela and relations with the Holy See, with the papacy. Then the second part, I'll speak about the relations of the government and the Venezuelan Bishops' Conference, which has been very prolific, particularly with documents. And finally, the incidents, the question of the government on social action. This is also a topic that is currently very, very in vogue in our country, and that has also been amply commented upon, particularly by the pastors of the Venezuelan church. And so, by way of introduction, I should say that in Venezuela, during these past 20 years, has had excellent nuncios who have worked in order to strengthen the relationship between the Church of Rome and here the government in Venezuela. When Chavez became president, Monsignor Leandro Sandi was there, and he was at the front of the diplomatic corps with a person with great quality. And then we have other figures, 3 Italian nuncios, Monsignor Pietro Parolin, who is the Cardinal Secretary of State, and Monsignor Andrew Giordano, who just finished his mission in Venezuela. I would like to emphasize some topics in these documents that keep recurring in what the church, what's happened between the Roman Church and Venezuela. So something important I have to point out is the culture of tolerance. That is to say, in the pontifical documents, and for instance, the documents of the diplomatic mission has been commented on and collected in a beautiful volume about the history of the church in Venezuela that speaks of that element of toleration, which is important for establishing a dialogue in Venezuela. He says that we cannot have a Manichaean vision of history in Venezuela because normally during these years, in the government of Hugo Chavez Frias, as well as in the that of Nicolás Maduro, there has been much talk about the vision that exists of what they call the fourth regime, that is to say the years of democracy from 1958 until 1999. And it's a vision that's pretty negative and very dark. Whereas then there's the Fifth Republic, which follows with the triumph of Chavez, where we see the government of Maduro is held up as a very good state of governability. And in that culture of toleration, it's important not to condemn or disdain the adversary, rather to take a conciliatory attitude toward those who are adversaries, because as you know, in politics is extremely polarized. A second element that is important in these relations between the Holy See and Venezuela is the accompaniment of a dialogue. And I'd like to emphasize here on the word accompaniment. The Vatican, the Holy See, is not a vehicle for real creating a dialogue in Venezuela, carrying out what the Holy See wants to do is to accompany the dialogue. But this dialogue, the church must be the creator of a concord and a unity that is needed in order to be able to build in the country this reconciliation and solidarity. The dialogue is necessary in a democratic state. This is fundamental. And of course, so that these objectives, these common objectives can be brought about, it's important it's not about strengthening one position over another, but rather to establish a dialogue to build the common good of all Venezuelans, where all Venezuelans can participate. In the documents that are read, several conditions are described. These conditions, we can, in brief, describe them as being three. First, reciprocity. That is to say, we cannot do without each other, without the adversary, without the opposition. The common good. The common good is what matters, not putting one part of society over another. And so dialogue must take into account all social sectors. And of course, the rights of persons must be respected in this reciprocity. The second element that's discussed is the opening and the welcoming of points of view from all sides. That is to say, we have to appreciate the differences and specificities of the other. This is important. It's important that we cannot create a false compromise for this reason. And the third element that is discussed a lot in these documents is that there must be great lucidity, great clarity, especially where in dialogue, cannot be accompanied by an attack of those who don't want dialogue. And this is discussed in these various documents. That is to say that it's possible to disqualify, destroy, to discard a possible dialogue if there is not a clarity about the conditions for dialogue. It's also important. It's also talk of John Paul II and documents that where it's pointed out that for John Paul II, dialogue is to make of the other a neighbor, which is a Christian and gospel value. In the Vatican policy, there's always been a desire to help bring about this dialogue, because in 2001, the nuncio of His Holiness proposed to the President of the Republic a dialogue, to dialogue with those who think differently, his most fervent political opponents. This was received very negatively by the government at that time. The nuncio, the President Chavez, accused the church of being a church of the opposition, which was alienated from the poor and from the popular sector, although later the government went before it was said that the church is not an alternative to the power. The church does not propose any political project in particular, but rather wants to accompany a dialogue. Then the conditions were created to perhaps look again at a possibility of a dialogue. This time, not under John Paul II's pontificate, but rather under the pontificate of Pope Francis. And so a second proposal for dialogue is made under Pope Francis, where he sends a delegate who's sent to Venezuela to establish a dialogue. And this is between October 30th until December 6th of 2016. And this gets suspended in December because it's determined that the conditions for this dialogue is not being realized. Officially, the Vatican has not stated the conditions that had been asked for the dialogue, but it got filtered in the press that these were the conditions which could be discussed here because it's in the public domain. The first, that the Church wants for there to be humanitarian help to be accepted to address the disaster, the economic and social disaster and the sanitary disaster being lived in Venezuela. Second, the liberation of political prisoners. And the third is a transparent electoral process. And the fourth element is to restore the National Assembly according to the role provided for it in the Constitution. The Church, upon seeing this not being granted, saw itself in the necessity to not continue with the dialogue. So the Holy See is, of course, very concerned with human rights because for the ecclesiastical approach perspective, nor the nation, nor a political party, nor any political system is an absolute value. The dignity of the human person cannot be disrespected. When this happens, the Church sees itself as obligated to intervene, to speak out. And it's also been said that Juan Pablo II has placed the defense of human rights at the core of his magisterium and of his pontificate, at the heart of the Church's concerns. And later, another element that draws my attention is that he's also seen as a builder of the revolution of peace, so that peace is constructed not with weapons, not with conventional arms or by warfare, but rather the arms of peace are the fruit of the Spirit. This is a struggle that's waged with love, with forgiveness, and also with reconciliation, and the peace that demands the acceptance of difference. And John Paul II also rejects, or the Church rejects, any aggressive conduct toward the other. And the goal is to build a society that is progressively more just and fraternal, to defend the truth. Of course, to build this, it's also necessary to confront the enemies. Who are these enemies? Well, first, the abuse of power by state powers. Second, violence exerted by the violence against opposition to the government. Third, the inability to distinguish between authority and power. And this is very important because you can speak with authority. For example, but Jesus spoke with authority, but the Pharisees with power. And of course, there's also language about not making an idol out of political projects or ideological projects. A second element that I think we should present at this moment is the relationship between the government and the Venezuelan Bishops' Conference, which is something that is supported by the Holy See, as the Bishops' Conference in Venezuela has been highly critical of the government since 2000 until now, until 2021. With some elements that I would point us towards for reflection. A first element is the economic and political model that is dehumanizing. And what does this mean? Well, this idea is transversal in it's present in all the documents. You can see it in the long list of exhortations, of communications, letters written by the bishops in communion. The Holy See doesn't favor any particular political system, but I would like to draw our attention to a few things that we see in documents that are published this year, the bishops say, we suffer in our country the nefarious consequences of an economic model imposed by a regime and an ideology of communist design. And this is the deterioration that has been brought about by this communist model, has led to the deterioration of the quality of education, sanitary services, and basic services for the Venezuelan people, with an undetainable inflation, a devaluation of money that has impoverished gravely the population, and a forced people are forced to abandon the country, and where the police and the military persecute people who are forced to flee the country. And this is all the fruit of the colossal failure of the state's policies. There's also the problem since 2016, owing to the implantation of a political project that is totalitarian, which impoverishes the population, and that the government is obstinate about maintaining. And these policies of the government, which are supposedly to feed the populace, for example, these bags of food that are handed out, the bishops say that these are insufficient. They create a population of beggars and a dependency. These social and economic policies are infected with corruption. They have also been an element to enrich a privileged few who were close to the government, or people who are who have their positions because of the government. I also say this talking about the fissure, the fracture of the political system in Venezuela. Fray Guillermo spoke about this in the document that the bishops just recently released about the upcoming Sunday elections. The bishops say that our democracy is now is 63 years old. And they touch on two important points. First, the elections. He says that they are plagued with irregularities, serious irregularities. They're with very low participation. The populace doesn't really know. Also, these elections are not recognized by many international bodies, like the EU, for example. They don't acknowledge the results of these elections. There's a disqualification of the opposition leaders in these elections, as Father Guillermo was saying, and they propose. The bishops are proposing presidential and parliamentary elections that should be carried out with freedom and equality for all, with proper oversight by international bodies. The second element that is pointed out with regards to the fissure of the democratic system in Venezuela is that since 2015, there was elected the people chose a National Assembly which goes completely against the elected people who were completely against the agenda of the government, which was comprised of members of the opposition. And so what did the government do? They felt threatened by this and then created the constitutional National Assembly, which, of course, as the name implies, should be dedicated to reforming the Constitution. But the bishops affirm that the National Constitutional Assembly is, first of all, unconstitutional because it has not been elected by democratic means or by the means provided in the Constitution, and so it is undemocratic in its origin and it's illegitimate. It has not been created to redact a new constitution, but rather it functions as a super executive and judicial power. And so the law against hate and intolerance criminalizes any manifestations of opposition in the country. And the bishops would want the government to have a national electoral council that should be transparent and impartial. And of course, the bishops also speak as just like the Holy See about human rights. While we're having some technical difficulties because on the screen, I would like to, there he is. There's Osvaldo, brother. Sorry, we had, you froze for a moment. Forgive the bother because of the technical difficulty. But here we also have an opportunity to ask you a few questions that some have been writing in the comments because what you're pointing out is very important in this presentation. Brother Osvaldo, forgive me, you froze, and so the end of your presentation was cut off. But if you would please, some have asked about the reality of how has the order functioned with the government? How has the government kept a relationship with the friars, with the Dominican family, and with the church during these recent years? Is there a tension? How would you describe that relationship? You have the floor, Brother Osvaldo. Well, regarding the Dominican family, it's been affected above all in the work of education because the government has exerted pressure, pretty strong pressure, especially in schools and in educational institutions of the order. And this has not permitted that education can be undertaken freely without the interference of the government, which wants to pressure the curriculum that's used in the institutions. They don't want teacher salaries to be raised, and so there's been a real fiscalization of the government in these works educational works, and in parishes either, especially in popular areas. The government does not want to or does not accept the aid of any social projects that the Catholic Church might undertake and that are very difficult to carry out for that reason. Thank you. That's very helpful. I think another comment we had in the Q&A, others have mentioned the question of whether the government had confronted the church and your work in education, because, for instance, there are two people who commented in the Q&A here on the screen that they're already commenting on how is it that Fray Guillermo and the network of the Dominican family can offer a program of on civic education of the citizenry, our participation as good Christians, as good Catholics, right? Has there been any confrontation around this, or have you had a space where the government doesn't interfere too much in this? Some asked whether you have a program or some topics about civic participation of the citizenry. Does the government restrict what you can say or do about this? As teachers, why don't you speak about this a little bit? Well, sure, there's going to be some supervision. At this time, no, not so much. It doesn't exist. But it's possible that in the future, this might happen, that they might interfere, the government might interfere in this, especially when we're talking about promotion of human rights, when it's social promotion of social issues, then the government will want to get involved the way it has done with other works. with other Venezuelan religious congregations. Well, there are many more comments that we're going to include, but we'll wait until the end with our brother and presenter who is coming after you. Certainly, I'm sure you're going to want to comment on some comments in the chat, right? Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Brother Osvaldo. A big hug. And now, since you talked so much about a similarity with your topic, it's appropriate that we now invite to the conversation one of the leaders in the and outside of the country, Raskin Mortiel, an attorney and ex-consul of Venezuela, who is here from the civic realm and is a founding member of a group of La Colina, the civil association, which is an NGO for the democratic forces of Venezuela. Welcome, Reinaldo, and thank you for sharing some words following the line of this very important conversation at this time dedicated to what's happening in Venezuela. Onwards, you have the floor. Well, firstly, I would like to offer thanks to the Dominican family and to Brendan Curran for having invited me to participate in this webinar, dealing with the issues and problems lived currently by Venezuela. I have selected a few topics that I thought would be important to deal with in this webinar. And I'm going to begin immediately to address the first of these. This topic is the one that has to do with what we might call the characterization of the regime, of the Venezuelan regime, the regime that has Venezuela going through these terrible calamities. It would be very easy to see that in Venezuela there is a sort of dichotomy between democracy and dictatorship. The term dictatorship is already a term that has been coined for a very long time because it seems to be what would correspond with the reality lived by Venezuelans today. On the other hand, Venezuela, we already speak of Venezuela as a state which belongs to the international community, and we see that this is not enough. Venezuela is not a state like any other. Many investigators have pointed out that Venezuela is a failed state. A failed state whose territory is hijacked by a military and civil cabal which dominates public institutions of the country, which control its businesses, and which acts with threats, coercion of the Venezuelan populace in order to guarantee for itself control of economic activity and of other activities which are not licit. For example, narco traffic, drug traffic. And so in this sense, there are many who say that Venezuela is a hijacked country, hijacked by this military and civil cabal. But besides this, there are other elements that complicate matters even more grievously, the situation of Venezuela. And that Venezuela is a territory that's been penetrated by criminal groups, irregular terrorist groups, narco criminals, for example, from Colombia. I'm referring to the ELN, the National Liberation Army of Colombia, and the dissidency of the FARC, the Revolutionary Armies of Colombia, which impose their law on the population that they submit to their rule, and which control territories in particular on the western part of Venezuela, those that are nearest, of course, to the territory of Colombia. in Zulia State, Apure, Barinas. Those places have the presence of these irregular elements. But things don't end there, because first it was Chavez and later Maduro began their relations with Syrian and Iranian militias of the revolutionary military of those countries, and Islamist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. That is to say that, as we can see, Venezuela is not a simple territory where there's a military dictatorship combined with where they try to control everything, but rather that there has been a series of associations with all of these criminal elements that I have mentioned, which makes extremely complex the struggle, the political struggle in Venezuela. And so these groups act with at the good pleasure and with the complicity of those who have occupied power in these last 22 years in Venezuela. And they maintain, integral connections with this power structure in Venezuela. And we must also add to this a series of groups, of criminal groups, national criminal groups that were armed by the governments, first the government of Chavez and then Maduro. And so there is a criminality of groups within the nation in different parts of the country, and which act with complete impunity, that menace, that threaten the people, that control spaces where the Venezuelan population lives, and that create an environment of complete insecurity for that population, so that it would not be an exaggeration to say that in Venezuela there is a kleptocracy which is profoundly corrupt. That is to say, a government of thieves and criminals, which is made up by the worst politicians. And so, in this manner is that we can come to understand, observing what the caste that controls the government in Venezuela. Understanding this, we can understand how this enormous crisis, multivalent crisis, has been produced, because this is a multidimensional crisis, the crisis of Venezuela. That is to say that it covers all areas and all sectors of the country. Firstly, an economic crisis. An economic crisis of colossal proportions that has provoked, that has caused, for instance, that the greatest industry of the country, the oil industry and PDVSA, should have been completely destroyed by this cabal, this terrible cabal, which today cannot even benefit itself of the enormous power that it wielded by that industry, because it destroyed it. It destroyed the refineries. Don't work. They don't function. They don't have a proper production or market in accordance with what it should be. What the production of petrol should be in Venezuela. We should just remember, as a small detail, that when Chavez took the presidency of Venezuela in 1999, PDVSA produced 3,200,000 barrels of oil a day. Today, with great difficulty, they produce, with enormous difficulty, between 350 and 400,000 barrels a day of petroleum. We have, besides, an environmental crisis, from which the best way to express it is what's happening in the south of Venezuela, in the Arco Minero area, where there is a terrible ecological crisis of impressive magnitude that is being created. And besides, a business in which which is being controlled by the armed forces in part, and partly by these irregular groups that I mentioned previously, in particular the LLN and some of the militias of these groups, such as Hezbollah and Hamas. In Venezuela, there exists, besides an energy crisis, the product principally of this destruction of the oil industry, but besides that, these people, I don't know how they managed to destroy the energy park in Venezuela, which was constituted by its electrical system, which was one of the best in Latin America. Venezuela today has problems of power outages, permanent power outages. And besides, this happens with also with the administration of water and gas, which is with which most of the population of Venezuela depends on, the use of domestic gas, which used to be sold and was a regular service that was, functioned for distributing it to the Venezuelan populace. And of course, there's a social crisis, a social and humanitarian crisis of enormous proportions, where misery and hunger prevail, desolation, unemployment, all of which, by the way, has led to, in Venezuela, for the past 4 years approximately, an enormous migration without comparison in Venezuelan history or throughout Latin America, and only comparable to the emigration that we've seen come out of Syria. But as we know, in Syria, this is the product of a war in that country. The emigration in Venezuela is the product of the enormous destruction that these people have provoked, have caused, and have created, so that the population sees itself obligated to emigrate forcibly and voluntarily. That Venezuelans have been transformed into refugees and people who seek asylum in almost all the countries that are neighboring countries of Venezuela, from Colombia, which is the country that shares the greatest border extension with Venezuela. Has accepted many refugees from Venezuela. More than 1 million Venezuelans are in Colombia, but the number of emigres has gone past 6 million from Venezuela, and so we see that there is a terrible crisis in the social arena, in the sanitary arena. The regime has destroyed the entire sanitary system, the health system of hospitals. Hospitals lack equipment, as well as indispensable medicines to attend to the population. And this, again, it goes without saying that the medical population, for example, of doctors and nurses in Venezuela, many of them have come to join the great emigration out of Venezuela. And we also cannot go without mentioning the great educational crisis, which of course is very painful, because it has has led to educational institutions having lost teachers, among other things, because they earn a miserable $1 a day salary, and students do not receive the education nor the help that traditionally they used to receive, in particular in the secondary and primary education. And this, of course, has led to that in Venezuela. Recently, I saw there that there was a number in the past 3 years, 1,200,000 students and 176,000 teachers have abandoned the classrooms of the educational institutions in Venezuela. There are a lot of numbers, which of course Brother Guillermo mentioned one of them, a terrifying one. which pertains to the study of the national, how the government has handled COVID, research that the Central University Simon Bolivar and the Catholic University Andrés Bello have done a study about how the government has handled COVID, and there is a data that shows that the situation has gotten worse rather than better. And it's also the information about poverty. 94.5% of the population is poor in Venezuela, and more than 70% live in extreme poverty. That number alone is an eloquent description of the enormous tragedy being lived in Venezuela and that the Venezuelan population and all Venezuelans are living through. In that study, from that study, I have many, many numbers, but I don't want to fill you with numbers, simply to tell you that the numbers are absolutely sad, lamentable, because they make us aware of a country. They witness to a country that has been progressively impoverished, that lives in miserable conditions, where there's no guarantee of work, of employment, where there is no answer to the health or education problems. And upon mentioning health, this permits me to connect this to a consideration of that forms part of this tragedy. That with all of this situation, last year, as we all know, when the pandemic of COVID-19 began, and we could not expect anything else than what has happened. According to a piece of data, for example, which very recently given by the Pan American Health Organization, and only 14.8% of the inhabitants of Venezuela have received 2 doses of some vaccine. And the vaccines we know are distributed are the Russian vaccines, or the ones that are offered in Venezuela, and also from China. This implies that Venezuela is a country that is absolutely without protection or help before the pandemic. In the face of the pandemic. There are some official numbers that I'm going to mention because they're just simply laughable, and these are the government's numbers. According to the Venezuelan government, with this situation of lack of assistance or help for the population where almost no one is vaccinated, according to the government, there are 422,915 persons who have been infected. I repeat, 422,915 infected persons with COVID, and the dead in Venezuela are 5,057. Of course, no one believes these numbers. This is nothing more than a terrible and painful manipulation of what is happening in Venezuela, where, besides everything, the number of doctors and nurses that have died is considerable. For every 500 people, the number of doctors and nurses. So that, well, we're talking about a regime that during these 22 years has taken a country that used to have all the possibilities of being incorporated with some good governments to some incredible levels of development, more in accord with the world we live in, but instead has taken the country to this enormous tragedy happening in Venezuela. I would like, in order to start closing and permit that the participants can provide their questions, I would like to mention that at this time, the democratic elements of, I don't call them opposition because that's a more complex matter. The opposition in Venezuela is is a very diverse opposition. It's not like it was before. Let's say back in 2008 or 2015, the opposition, the regime, besides, has abused its power in order to create its own opposition. And that's why I would like to speak instead of the democratic forces, the democratic elements. They are at this time, with the help of the Kingdom of Norway, which is acting as a facilitator for some negotiations, which have already had been installed in Mexico in February. In another new attempt, the representatives of Maduro's government and these democratic elements in Venezuela to try to come to some agreements to see how to come out of this Venezuelan tragedy. We all know, and I'm going to just in brief say that on that day of August 13th, a memorandum of understanding was signed to establish the agenda for the negotiations. But we all know that each side had its own objectives. The regime had a central objective, which was to seek the lifting of sanctions against by the U.S., Canada, and the EU, placed against the Venezuelan government for the past 5 years. And the Venezuelan democratic elements, what they wanted, it was the possibility to have an accord that can guarantee a political change in Venezuela, for which it will be fundamental to have clean, transparent, democratic elections with respect of the norms of the Constitution and of rule of law that will permit that these elections be elections in which the whole Venezuelan populace may participate. And of course, I'm talking about presidential elections, as well as that elections of the National Assembly. Next Sunday, within 48 hours, we will have in Venezuela elections that are regional elections. They are elections to elect governors, mayors. Lamentably, there will not be a good turnout for those because the democratic elements are divided. Some decided to participate, some decided to abstain. But the regime will not come out looking good either. That is to say, the result will be bad for everybody. But basically, and it's what everybody is expecting, Monday the 22nd, all of those democratic elements in Venezuela will have to sit down and will have to begin discussing what to do next after, for what remains of 2021 and moving into 2022. And so some proposals will arise, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, because let's let the political groups work on this. And now I'm going to stop here, because I think I've reached more or less the time that I think I was given to make my presentation. But I'm very glad to answer any questions you might have. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Reynaldo. Very profound and very complex, this matter, right? The very delicate matter of the structures that you mentioned of, for example, of drinkable water, people with different capacities to obtain employment, electrical power. This is an enormous change of for example, of within the systems of electricity, gas, and other systems in the country that used to be a model. Venezuela used to be a model for other countries not long ago, but in recent years we've seen how we can see other structures in Venezuela developing instead. Several people asked, what do these upcoming Sunday elections mean? Could you... this seems so complex. How to describe it in few words? The reality of those in government, of the governors, of the mayors, of this structure are part of this upcoming Sunday election, and how power might transition peacefully. This is all in question and will lead to many comments about what will happen on Monday. Something very important that several participants in the chat have said, and first I'd like to thank the participants. Many come from north, south, east, and west. They come from different countries, different regions of the world. We're here from Rome, we're here from South America, Central America, North America, and many other places. From Philippines, there's one person participating who's in the Philippines. Thank you so much for your participation and for your patience, because we've had quite a diversity of time zones depending on where we happen to be today. But something very worrisome has been mentioned. If I am correct, you mentioned that there are less than 15% of the population that has received vaccines up until today. But the government reports that there have only been a little over 400,000 people positive for COVID and only a little more than 5,000 dead. Has been published by these numbers by the government. We are very worried about this, not only in Venezuela, but other parts of the world. When there is a public number and then an internal number of what the real statistics are. This is very worrisome. You also mentioned almost 77% of the population is living in extreme poverty. This is a horror to hear, knowing that only 40 years ago, the strength of Venezuela, only 2 generations ago. Question. Some are asking in the chat. First, why? And you probably already know, but why don't you maybe emphasize this? 2 questions. Why do you think that the people are not participating in the elections? Brother Guillermo began, and then Osvaldo also discussing this very. We can probably assume the answer to this, but it's best that you comment on it. And then I would like to ask you another question about how others in solidarity could collaborate with you. And please, Osvaldo, if you could also comment on this question asked by one of our participants. You have the floor, Reynaldo. Why are the people not voting in the elections, or how do you see the civic participation? Osvaldo could also comment on this. Yes. In Venezuela, it happens not for these elections coming on Sunday, but this has been happening in in recent elections, especially. There is an election I'm going to mention, which is the one that happened on the 6th of December of 2015. On that day, the National Assembly was elected, and in those elections, the opposition in Venezuela, which was grouped together at the time in a structure called the Table of Democratic Unity. In that election, the MUR, as the acronym of this organization, they got 2/3 of the members of that. They were elected to 2/3 of the National Assembly. This was the result, a completely unexpected result by Maduro's government. They never imagined that could happen, that the opposition could get 2/3 of the assembly, because that meant that those 2/3 parts, the National Assembly had a qualified majority that would allow them to carry out a series of modifications and changes that were necessary. And these were the designation of a new Supreme Court of Justice, selection of a new Attorney General of the Republic, of a new comptroller, a new defender in the country. In other words, the whole structure in the government could be changed. They could designate that following year a new electoral national council, and by consequence, they would have been with the possibility to go to, let's say, some transparent and legal and clean elections. So what happened? The regime immediately, but when I say immediately, I mean that the month of December didn't even go by. As of the 6th of December, the regime dedicated itself step by step to dismantle that majority from the Venezuelan opposition. And that led to the two following years, in 2016, which was a year in which there was the possibility of asking for a referendum, and Maduro didn't allow it. And in 2017, the population of Venezuela started to protest. And the repression that the regime used was terrible. In 2017, in 3 months, more than 346 youths were killed in the streets, shot by the regime. And when we went to the next election in 2018, with all of these precedents, well, the population felt that they were lacking any support or any right to have a clean election and get an honest result. If they saw what happened, the fruit of what happened in 2015, and what I'm trying to say with this story is that starting from that point, you started seeing a loss of motivation in the population, because they felt that there was no way to defeat the government that was behaving not only illegally and against the Constitution in an arbitrary way, but besides in a very repressive and violent manner. They would actually, whoever was going to go out to the street to protest was risking their life. And I think that lamentably. Oh, and of course, the large number of political prisoners that started also being in evidence. And so the regime has dedicated itself to dismantling all possibility within the institutions to have an election. And so, of course, the population is lacking in motivation. It's disconcerted, incredulous. They don't believe that this will make there's any point to this. And so, the upcoming Sunday election, since they're regional, the population doesn't really feel very motivated. Besides, perhaps the fact that the opposition, the democratic elements couldn't get it together. They couldn't really formulate a plan to unify everyone, and so the people don't have the same motivation to go out and vote. This is one of the things that we have to find a way, starting on Monday the 22nd, when the democratic groups come together. That's one of the things that they have to find a way to correct. This has to change. And the negotiations from Mexico, which, as I mentioned, what we in the democratic groups are looking for in Mexico is the carrying out with the support of the international community, which I haven't emphasized enough, of clean, transparent, democratic, constitutional elections in Venezuela. Thank you so much for these words and for the comments. We have many questions, which upon seeing Brother Osvaldo here, I would like to ask him a favor that he should please answer this question. Knowing that there is an oppression in the institutions in educational institutions, how can the Dominican family participate or pursue its work of educating conscience of students and their families participating in Dominican institutions, knowing that there is a lot of accusation by the government of wanting to, or the idea that of trying to implement their own ideologies, political ideologies in the education institutions. Could you please answer this, Brother Osvaldo? Well, I'm not only going to talk about the experience of Dominican schools in Venezuela. There is a group that is comprised of all the different schools that are administered by religious men and women known as AVEC, the Venezuelan Association of Catholic Education. And from the AVEC, from that organization, which groups together all these schools, for example, Fe y Alegría, which are the schools run by the Jesuits, which are 177 schools in indigenous and rural areas. There already exist programs that are implemented in all of these schools, so that there's a commitment there to educate and of promoting a social responsibility. And this is the line that I think all schools have taken on, not just Dominican schools, but all schools that belong to the different religious congregations that have already designed a program, as I have already said, a program of promotion of social awareness, which seeks to educate people in the democratic system, in the values, in authentically human values, and that this should be a topic that not only addresses students, but also involves working with parents and with those who are the representatives of these students from these schools. That helps. That's a very deep topic, and this is why in a moment I'm going to mention that the next webinar will deal completely focusing on the structures of the Dominican family in Venezuela, so that participants will be able to address this much more directly into our role and our voice, the voice of the Dominican family for the future and in these very tense days. I'd also like to mention, firstly, to say thank you to Sister Dusty Farnan, who is the representative of the Order of the Dominican family in New York. She also has, there's also a team with us for a voice, to pass the voice, to analyze what we see happening among the people of Venezuela or any other place in the world where there's crisis, and we collaborate and pass on information to guarantee that people in those parts of the world are not alone. And so the courage is important in these webinars, thanks to the work of the courage of Reynaldo and other leaders in Venezuela and outside of Venezuela who are working hard to maintain the voice of hope for a better future for Venezuela. We remind everyone of this and would like to mention our gratitude for this on this day. We know that on Sunday there will be elections in Venezuela. We remind and we ask for God's help to guide us through this. And as Reynaldo mentioned, we should not forget the importance of a conscious, of a proper analysis and conscience among leaders, both civic leaders and leaders in the government, in order to analyze properly where are we going after all of this? What would be a step toward the future for a better way, a better future for Venezuela? We would also like to mention that we have several collaborators at this event. First, As I had said, thank you to the whole team at an international level for justice and peace for the Dominican family, among them Dusty Farnan in the New York office, which I just mentioned, because this forms a part of a chain connecting the interior of Venezuela to other places outside of the country and places in the UN where there's negotiation. This international body is extraordinarily important, especially at this time in Venezuela. What you see outside of the country or inside the country, we need to maintain that in a network so that we can keep that network, that chain going, so that we can witness to the truth and to human dignity, or the lack of human dignity in the country, in Venezuela and outside of Venezuela and all over the world. The system works this way thanks to the help and collaboration of sisters, brothers, laity, youth, the nuns as well, and all the branches of the Dominican family have made possible this series of webinars in which we have had the honor and the opportunity to serve and we in North America, we are promoters made up of sisters, friars, laity, nuns, and youth in the United States, Canada, and other countries who have collaborated to produce this webinar. I would also like to recognize Reg McKillop, the co-promoter with me in North America, as well as the whole Dominican family of Justice and Peace in Venezuela, as well as the international director, Aníbal Ocurre, and the whole international team, and all our office in the United Nations, where our presence is represented, and our work to protect in the future peoples like the people of Venezuela during these times. I would like to ask all of you who are invited, our guests. We're going to conduct a profound analysis of the church in Venezuela on the 10th of December at 2 p.m. at 8 a.m. in Chicago time, or 9 a.m. Eastern time, or 10 a.m. Caracas time. More details will be forthcoming about this webinar. There will be other activities during every week of Advent, appropriate to the organization of the Dominican family in Venezuela. We are very grateful. There are more than 100 participants in this event. Soon we will share this recording of this event in order to benefit those who could not be with us live. We would like to thank those who have served as interpreters into French and English in order to help relieve the language barrier in our international community. We would like to pray with you in the Dominican family of Venezuela. As you wrote, upon inaugurating this month of peace, we dream of a country with greater opportunity. We dream with be able to have the university we dream of our children being able to return to Venezuela. We dream of a country in which there will be access to justice. We dream of a country in peace, and we dream of a country with democracy. Blessings on all of you. Let us maintain this network, this chain, alive and active, to maintain the solidarity and, above all, to maintain the health and dignity of the people of Venezuela. Congratulations. I return to our presenters, Reinaldo Raskin and also Osvaldo and also Guillermo, who made their presentations on this day. God bless you all, and see you soon on the 10th of December for the next webinar. God bless you. Thank you.